Good afternoon, everyone. I see people trickling in already. My name is Beatrice Lopez, and I'm the Commissioning Editor for Research and Study Skills at Open University Press. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this webinar with Steve Waters and Helen Johnson, the authors of our best-selling title, Doing Your Research Project, which is now in its 8th edition. So the structure of the event will be as follows. I'll introduce the authors, hand over to them for their presentations, and then I'll share a Q&A with them. Please feel free to submit questions for the Q&A in the chat during their presentations. And just for your information, this webinar will be recorded and emailed to everyone who registered for the event. So before handing in to the authors, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to them. So Steve Waters taught English and drama for 30 years in high schools. He subsequently worked for a local authority for 6 years as a consultant. While teaching, Steve carried out several educational research projects for an advanced diploma in educational management and a master's in education, both with the Open University. His experiences as a first-time and developing researcher helped to shape Doing Your Research Project. Steve is now a co-founder of TeachWell Toolkit, supporting the mental health of staff in schools. And Helen Johnson is Principal Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Brighton, co-director of the University's Centre for Arts and Wellbeing, and Associate Lecturer at the Open University. She has over 15 years experience teaching research methods and supervising student research projects from undergraduate to doctoral level. Helen has particular expertise in qualitative, creative, and participatory research methods and in community university partnership working. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve.
Thank you, Beatrice, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I'm going to shut off my video so that it's not a distraction, and then we'll take you through the structure of Doing Your Research Project and explain why we think that it's a useful tool for your students, whether they're a first-time researcher or developing researcher. So you've heard about our professional backgrounds, and it's important to stress that the book arises out of our own research experience, and we, like many researchers, have many successes, but we've also come across challenges. And we hope that in coming across those challenges, by inserting them into the book, we'll prevent your students making the same mistakes as we did. So the purpose of the webinar is to show you how the book is divided into sections which follow the structure of a research journey. This is a shot of the table of contents, which are expanded in the book to hone down on the details of each chapter. But essentially, part one is preparing the ground. And that means, what do you do? We ask the question, what do you do before you start the research? What do you need to do? And what position do you need to take? What perspective do you need to take about the research that you are embarking on? So that covers the research journey, how we look at the world, and Helen will explain how she inserted her own area of expertise in looking at the world in a particular way during research. Planning the project, we look at ethics and integrity, we look at reading and referencing and how you actually reference. We look at the literature research and how you carry out a literature review. Then in part two, we focus on data collection. And it's essentially that section looks at both qualitative and quantitative methods and why and how you would use each one of those approaches depending on the research topic that you have chosen. And then finally, in part 3, you've collected your data. Now, what do you do with it? So this looks at how you analyze data and how you then report the data as findings in your research. And finally, last but not least, is writing the report. So that looks at how you structure a report, what a typical research project report looks like. And it gives helpful guidance on getting started. And then, as you would expect, there's a very large reference section where students can focus in on a particular aspect of research and find some really helpful guidance from other people who've done particular kinds of research. So the book answers the following questions. Why carry out research? What are the key ingredients of a research project? What is a literature search and why is it important? Are you going to embark on qualitative or quantitative research or a mixed methods approach? What data collection methods should your students use? How should your students analyze the data? And how should they structure the research report? So this is a kind of a typical research journey that you would expect someone to take. And you can apply the book to your own particular way of presenting this structure. So what we've tried to do in the book, and this has been right from the start, is to offer a friendly but informative style. So we try to avoid heavy sections of text, particularly if it's written in the passive voice. So I'm just going to read through. I don't intend to read through every slide, but I'm just going to read through this screenshot of the beginning of part 1 because I think it illustrates the the style of the book. So preparing the ground. As a first-time researcher, you're probably a little daunted by the task ahead of you. Not only are you faced with deciding what or who you're going to research, but also how you're going to collect data, what to do with it when you've got it, and how to write up your findings. As the maze on the front cover suggests, the path ahead is unlikely to be direct, and you will take many twists and turns and go down a few blind alleys before you reach your goal. I understand how you might be feeling. After all, I was once in the same position myself. I wrote this book to act as your guide through the maze of research and to give you advance warning of possible dead ends and pitfalls so that you can avoid making the same mistakes I once made. We all learn by making mistakes and experiencing failure, but it is much less painful to learn from other people's errors. And so that is typical of the style of the book. It addresses the reader as you throughout, and the author is indicated by the use of the first person I. So it's as if we were trying to talk to the researcher, your student. Okay, so these are the reasons why, your typical reasons why students should carry out research, perhaps as part of a degree course, a thesis for PhD. And although the book is identified as for first-time researchers, nevertheless, we have received many comments from PhD researchers who've said that they bought the book and it was a really valuable guide through their research journey. Perhaps your students have been funded by an external body, or it may be required as part of your job role, such as in Helen's job in lecturing. So whatever the reason, the principles, methods, and report follow the same structure. So could you tell us in the chat about your current supervisory role? So what position are you in relation to students, and what are the key challenges you face when supporting students conducting research for the first time? You don't need to write in sentences. Note form is absolutely fine. So perhaps just 2 or 3 different phrases to explain what your role is and what challenges you know students face when researching for the first time. So if you just insert those into the chat, we'll pick up on the insertions into the chat, including questions at the end of the webinar. So while you're doing that, I'm going to take you on to the next slide. So we asked the question, what are the key ingredients of a research project? Well, clearly the first thing that a student has to do is to ask a question to which they want an answer. So I've given you an illustration here. What impact does social media have on teenagers aged 14 to 17? So this is the question you're attempting to answer in the research. So it's also useful to have a hypothesis. So perhaps your hypothesis is using social media causes anxiety in teenagers aged 14 to 17. But that is only a guess. You don't actually know that until you have carried out your data collection. And I often make the analogy with a detective investigating a crime. So a detective investigates a crime by going to the crime scene and forming a hypothesis in their mind about what has happened during that crime scene. However, they can't allow themselves to be influenced too much by that hypothesis, because what they need to do next is to find evidence which supports the hypothesis. And your students will be in exactly that position. So in them, they formulated an idea that anxiety is caused by teenagers focusing on social media, but now they need to go and ask those teenagers questions in order to determine whether that their hypothesis is actually factually correct or not. And then we look at the methodology, qualitative or quantitative, or are you going to use a mixed methods approach? So an example of a mixed methods approach would be, how do you feel when people attack you on social media? So that's an open question. So that is qualitative, but you also might want to know how many hours those teenagers spend on social media each day, Monday to Friday. And that is a quantitative measure. And when you're submitting when you're analyzing your findings, you'll consider how you will interleave the quantitative data with qualitative. And then, and that obviously is going to take place during the analysis. And then write your research report. So I often focus on these research questions with new researchers. So the 5 W's and 1 H. So why, who, what, when, where, and the 1 H, how. And you need to be able to answer all of those questions in order to determine the form that your research project and your research report will take. So understanding the purpose and significance, identifying the subject, define the main focus. What is the time frame for your research? What is the location or context? And what is appropriate methodology to address your research question? The when question, I find with PhD students, is often vague. And this is why some PhD students spend 7 years getting their PhD, because they haven't got an idea in their mind about when each particular stage of their research is going to be completed. And we advocate that students set deadlines for themselves, which can be moved. But if you don't set a deadline in the first place, then the research tends to go on for longer than you intended, and sometimes you lose focus by doing that. So if you would like, please, to enter into the chat how you guide students to formulate their research question, and is this an area they struggle with? Okay, as you're entering into the chat, I'll move on. So the next question is, what is a literature review? And I'll move the points on if you can read through this slide yourselves, please. And then in the book, we give an example of APA referencing. So I've used the example of social media in children and adolescents, an actual study. And then we explain the Harvard referencing system, which is used more universally for students doing this kind of project. And there's an example there from our book. So the question is, when students are considering the methods, what should they bear in mind? And again, I'm not going to read through the slide, but I will move it on in terms of the points. Again, I'll move through the slide one point at a time. If you can read through it, please. We've got a question there, which we'd like you to consider and enter into the chat. So which of the two methods are your supervisees, your research students using? And how did you guide them to select that particular method? Does that correspond? Does your guidance correspond to the way that we've phrased or structured the questions that the students need to consider in order for them to make a decision? Just go back to that slide because I ended it pretty abruptly. Just give you a couple more seconds to read through it. Okay, and I'm going to hand you over to Helen, who's going to explain this new material that she has created for the book on creative research methods.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about some of the new sections that are in the books, particularly around creative research methods and other kind of ways of doing research differently. All research is creative in the sense that it invites us to think critically and to produce creative responses to problems. We need to be creative when we're coming up with research topics and questions, when we're selecting tools and techniques to address them, and when applying them in the field. Increasingly, researchers also use creative ways of communicating their findings to others. So we might turn to blogs, podcasts, posters, and visual arts, for example. And these styles of reporting can be particularly effective when trying to reach audiences that lie outside of academia, like participants, policymakers, and practitioners. But research that sits under the umbrella of creative research methods differs from mainstream qualitative and quantitative research in that it questions more established ways of thinking about and carrying out research. So creative research in this sense is characterized by a resistance to binary black and white thinking, a tendency to straddle boundaries, such as those that divide different disciplines, and a sense of innovation or playfulness. In the book, we talk about these briefly. We talk about the 5 different methods for creative research, which Helen outlines. So these are research using technology in innovative ways, multimodal research based on methodological innovation and experimentation, embodied research, transformative research frameworks, and arts-based research. And these aren't mutually exclusive approaches. So, for example, arts-based research often explores embodied experience, while technology could play a central role in research that's multimodal. And arts-based research is sometimes talked about in the literature as being equivalent to creative research methods. So some of the work that we want to do here is helping students to understand how these might be distinct and some of the different kinds of creative research methods that are available. But there's also a huge amount of work at the moment, some really exciting work around arts-based research specifically. So we expand on arts-based research and say a little bit more about that. So each of these approaches to creative methods comes with its own strengths and weaknesses, and each raises its own particular practical and ethical challenges. Each approach is also appropriate for different kinds of research question and research problems. And really, as with any method, the most important thing, of course, is to use the right tool for the job. So that's something that we try to help people through in the book. So we don't use creative methods just because they're fun and different, although they really are. And Jamie Moran has a wonderful metaphor for this, which is in the book as well. You can catch a shrimp in a certain finely laced fishing net. Try to catch a whale in the same net, and the net breaks, or the whale is shredded into small bits. If we insist everything must be like a shrimp to fit our net, then the bigger and deeper realities elude us. Research is messy. Research is applied to lots of different problems, lots of different contexts, and by people with lots of different theoretical perspectives. So we really want to try and give a guide in a very accessible and introductory way to some of these key approaches in the book. And creative research methods is a big part of that in terms of emerging approaches. So in the book, we explore the nature, principles and application of creative methods, delving deeper, as I say, into arts-based research in particular. We discuss the nature, forms and function of arts-based research, as well as its strengths and limitations. And we offer readers a window into exploring these approaches further through annotated further readings and through 3 vignettes which highlight varied examples of arts-based research in practice. So we introduce readers to Jacquitar, which is an arts-based educational novel exploring the intersection of masculinity, sexuality, social class, race, language and culture. To Rufus Stone, which is an award-winning short film and key output from a 3-year-long research project focusing on the lived experiences of older gay men in rural areas of England and Wales, and to the Researching Discrimination Through Poetry project, which worked with young spoken word artists in Canada to explore how poetry could be used to understand and communicate lived experiences of discrimination. So on the next slide, I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the other new bits in the book. So one of the key new areas that we've introduced is around ontology and epistemology. And ontology and epistemology are unfamiliar terms to most novice researchers and many experienced researchers as well. But these concepts are absolutely fundamental to and underpin every aspect of our research. Writing in this area can be incredibly dense and complex. And I've struggled through my teaching career to find accessible resources for researchers across all different stripes and all different sort of levels that help them to understand what ontology and epistemology are and what different kind of approaches there might be out there. So that's one of the reasons, one of the things that we really wanted to do with this was create that accessible guide. So the ideas themselves are relatively straightforward, even though most of the writing around this is very dense. So ontology refers to our ideas about the nature of reality or being, what we think the world is, what we and the world are made of. And this entails making claims and assumptions about the nature of reality. So what it exists, what it looks like, what units it's made up of, how these units interact with each other. Epistemology refers to our ideas about how we can come to know this reality, what it means to know something, and what knowledge looks like. This also covers the limits of knowledge, or what we think it's not possible to know. And these concepts matter because we rely upon theories about reality and knowledge when we read about, design, conduct, and apply research. Important then to all aspects of our research, kind of from start to finish. So from the questions we ask, how we understand the relationships between researchers and participants, how we evaluate quality in research and so on. They have implications for ethics and values that underpin our research and the ways in which we choose to communicate our work to others. So the book highlights the ontological and epistemological assumptions that we inevitably make when doing research. You can't get away from making these kinds of assumptions. And it uses worked examples to explore how these might impact a given study. It then considers in greater detail logical positivism, interpretivism, social constructionism, and critical realism, looking at the core underpinning beliefs and methodological implications of each approach in turn. This section also explores positionality and reflexivity, considering how the researcher's role is understood differently within different theoretical frameworks and what the methodological implications of this are. The section is supported then by a list of key terms, annotated further readings and cross-referenced observations and throughout relevant sections of the book. So it's linked to things like our discussion of qualitative research and creative research elsewhere. When we're thinking about qualitative research, we need to think about how we might evaluate it and how we might evaluate it differently. And again, this is something that I found that novice researchers can really struggle with, particularly those who've had a lot of experience with quantitative research methods and a kind of logical positivist framework, then coming into qualitative research, because it's so much more intuitive, because we talk about subjectivity and the researcher's position and so on, there can be this feeling that anything goes and you just do whatever you feel like. But of course, that's not the case. So that's one of the things that we're trying to address here. How do we understand robustness in qualitative research? How might that be different to in quantitative research? So this is part of expanded content on qualitative research and associated revisions. And it's linked to and supported by new content on the researcher's role and onto epistemology in particular. The concepts of validity, reliability and representativeness are typically understood quite differently within qualitative research, where the aim is to understand a small group in rich detail rather than to derive general laws of cause and effect. So in qualitative research, the specific nature of the sample and both the immediate and wider socio-historical context in which data are collected are seen as important features of the study rather than variables to be controlled. So the findings need to be understood in relation to this context. Furthermore, the researcher may be conceptualised as playing an active role in shaping the study rather than as a passive observer. And as I say, just like with quantitative researchers, qualitative researchers seeks to carry out rigorous research that's meaningful, robust, and reveals truths that have values beyond the borders of a single study or the judgments of a single researcher. So qualitative research is often evaluated in terms of trustworthiness. And the book talks about trustworthiness in terms of 5 core components: credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability, and authenticity. And these are defined in turn. They're looked at in relation to comparable quantitative research concepts, and the contrasts between them are explored. So those concepts are defined, and it briefly considers how these might be established and how they might be assessed in qualitative research. And then finally, participatory research and partnership working are all about actively involving people in the research process who are not academics. And again, these are areas that are really important in terms of methodological developments, and it's increasingly important for novice researchers to understand about. So they're about, in participatory research, it's about working with members of a community as co-researchers, collaborating with one another to design, conduct and disseminate a research project that is co-owned, which is quite different to the traditional research model, where participants are typically viewed as vessels of data. In this traditional model, participants' needs and understandings are usually taken into account to ensure a study is ethically sound and that instructors are clearly understood. But beyond that, it's not anticipated or desired that participants take any active role in the research. So participatory research is very different in that sense. Partnership working is about working together with representatives of community groups, practitioners and others in what's often termed a community university partnership, or CUP. A CUP might use participatory research methods or adopt a more traditional design, with academics leading data collection and analysis throughout. But where they differ from the traditional research model is that research is designed with input from both academic and non-academic partners for mutual benefit. Non-academic partners are also often involved at other stages of the research, such as facilitating access to participants as gatekeepers or disseminating research to key stakeholders. And this is something that particularly postgrad PhD researchers are increasingly looking to do as part of their research. So the book considers the nature, applications, strength and limitations of these approaches. It looks at different forms of participation and participatory research, with particular focus on community university partnerships and on participatory action research. And examples are given here from research and from teaching contexts. And finally, the section is supported with an annotated further reading list. That's all from me. I'm going to hand back.
Okay, thank you so much, Helen, for covering that area, which is, well, for me, was very complex. But Helen's done a great job in explaining and guiding students through what is sometimes, I think, made more obscure by the dense language of some texts that I've seen on this area of research. And Helen, it makes it so easily accessible. And also, I think, takes the research concept to a kind of a higher level. So for researchers perhaps who are studying for masters and PhD, this is certainly an area that is becoming more prevalent and more understood and perhaps more sought after. So the final section of the book looks at how students should structure the research report. And we look at a range of key issues. So first of all, your institution, the institution of the student, will have guidelines that they need to follow. And this is their first port of call, really. What are those guidelines? And then we point out some obvious ingredients of the research report, but sometimes these ingredients are not stated sufficiently clearly, or sections are left out. So we look at the title page with a subtitle. Is it going to be a title as a statement or a title as a question? We need to have their name and the date on that title page. And then the next section is acknowledgement. So who would you like to thank for helping you through the research project? Then a contents page. The contents page perhaps is not essential in every research project. It depends on the length of the project itself. A short project probably wouldn't need them, but certainly any project which runs to 5,000 words or more benefits from a contents page, because the reader can be directed to a specific section that they want to analyze rather than having to hunt through it themselves. And then an abstract. So we've set here a 1-paragraph overview. Again, if it's a research project at PhD level, you might have more than 1 paragraph, but certainly the abstract should be a condensed, easy to read summary of the research study and the findings presented in an overview. What are the aims of the study? What previous literature has found in terms of the subject matter of the research? What other people have found? And that is essential to be weaved into the research project itself, because the student will refer to what has been found previously, either to support what they've found or to present findings which have contradicted what has been found before, and then explain how and why those contradictions have occurred. And then the methodology, the results, what data has been collected, and then analysis, followed by a discussion. So what has the analysis told you about the research statement or research question you asked in the beginning? And then finally, summary and conclusions, and usually an alphabetical list of references using the Harvard system, but could be an APA format. And finally, the appendices. So if you've used a survey, if you've sent a survey to respondents, a copy of that survey. If you've interviewed respondents, a copy of the interview questions, so that the reader can see what exactly you've been asking to gain your data. And that is critical, because on the data, you will start to make assumptions and conclusions. And if the questions themselves are faulty, then that leads to faulty data. So that's a kind of whiz-bang tour through the structure of the book. And perhaps this is a good time to return to the chat, but also for you to ask any questions that might have cropped up while we were presenting. So I'll hand you over to Beatrice, who is in charge of the supervising the chat, and I'll also start my camera.
So we've got a few comments in the chat already. Yeah, Helen kicked things off regarding her role teaching research methods to undergrads and masters, supervising 9 PhD students, and having challenges with messiness of the field and coming up with ideas for research. Gillian is a doctoral supervisor, and she also said that the application of a suitable theoretical framework seems like a challenge for the students. Helen's undergrads struggle with coming up with research questions. And yeah, in terms of the choice of research method, Gillian says that the research question is formulated, how the research question is formulated drives the method, usually qualitative or MM approaches. I think Gillian had a question about one of the slides where yeah, qualitative methodologies as interviews and quantitative methodologies as service, because they would consider both interviews and surveys as methods and not methodologies. But I think Helen has replied to that already. I agree, Gillian. I think it's just how the slide has come out. These methods are intended here to provide examples of methods typically used within particular methodological approaches. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Steve.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think so. I think.
Okay.
I think what we try to do in the book is to make it clear that one approach in, for example, gathering data about, well, I'll use the example of the social media research. If you gather data on how many hours teenagers use social media, then that doesn't tell you much beyond how many hours they're spending. So if you're going to ask that question and collect quantitative data, you must have a purpose in asking it. And sometimes when I read research reports, questions have been asked, data's been collected, but the student hasn't made it clear what the purpose of collecting that data was. So when you combine qualitative and quantitative data, each will have its purpose, and sometimes the qualitative data will be gathered from questions that arise out of the questions that you're asking about quantitative data. So, for example, in the social media study, can we say that the longer students spend on social media during the week on average, can we relate that to their level of anxiety? So the question in the student's mind before they've asked that question is, okay, well, can I explore that relationship? And it's a kind of a balancing act for one set of data to elucidate another set of data. So when they're reporting it, if they report students spent 20 hours on average a week on social media, and then they report anxiety as a result of spending time on social media, unless they combine those two sets of data, you can just have bold statements about each of them. Whereas it would be useful to know to what extent anxiety increases the more time you spend. So I hope I've illustrated that sufficiently. I think that in my experience, that's one of the areas that students struggle with. And I think that's because they focus on the research question at the beginning, which hopefully will define their research. But in collecting the data, that leads to further questions. And perhaps they're not asking those questions of themselves as the data comes in. So they need to look at that data with a fresh approach, really, and say, okay, so what is this data telling me? It is related to my research question, but actually it throws up another question.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. This is from Gillian Forrester. Very helpful to know what is new in the book. I had my first copy of the book as an undergrad in 1998.
Wow.
And have used the editions ever since. Now I'm a professor in education and currently supervise 14 PhD EdD students. I see many more students going for qualitative and mixed methods research these days. Hardly any seem to do quantitative research. Any thoughts?
Do you want me to speak to that?
Yeah,
or
yeah, sure, Helen.
okay.
You're in
So
I
thought I had quite a lot of PhD students, but 14 is impressive. So yeah, well, when I was an undergrad, which was a little bit past 98, but not massively actually. I think we had a couple of sessions on qualitative research. Qualitative research was seen as being this sort of strange and unusual thing, and now it's something that's required. So within psychology, it's required by the BPS, who regulate our degrees, and qualitative research is seen as being, a key way of understanding the world. It's not by most people now. It's not marginalised and seen as sort of just whatever you feel like, or not rigorous. Although there are certainly still disciplines where those debates are being had, and people who were caught that when they were undergrads, who still carry that forwards. For me, qualitative research it addresses the kinds of questions I'm interested in generally, and so of course I tend to attract the kind of students who are interested in the kinds of things I'm interested in. Also lots of creative and arts-based research methods, which has almost taken the place of where qualitative research was 20 years ago. And that's now the sort of strange radical thing that you do, whereas qualitative research is much, much more mainstream. So I think that it was very much about, obviously, it's about using the right tool for the job. And, as I say, the kinds of questions that I'm interested in finding out the answers to are the sort of the hows, the whys, and the wherefores. I'm not so interested in establishing universal general laws. And my PhD students are interested in that kind of richness, the rich messiness of real life. And all of those complexities, and that for me is what's fascinating and what brought me into this. So I guess we attract students who are also interested and have similar perspectives to ourselves, but also then thinking about the mixed methods angle. That's particularly relevant for me in work that I do around community and partnership working, because the numbers are incredibly rhetorically persuasive. They can be very, you can very fast information, you can have the graphs, you can have the significant relationships, and they do a different kind of work. But I think part of it is about acknowledging as well where qualitative research has always been, in order to derive a survey in the first place, for instance, and to come up with a measure, the items in that measure, it comes from qualitative research. And of course, the world is, in some sense, or could be understood as being qualitative. In order to look at it through quantitative research, we have to find ways of operationalizing it, and we have to find ways of quantifying it. So yeah, I don't know if that addresses your question, but for me, I think it's great that qualitative research is much more mainstream and that creative research is attracting so much interest. And I think that it's very, very exciting, and I'm really pleased that students are doing this more and more.
It's an interesting question, because the first version of the book, written by Judith Bell, who is sadly no longer with us, the first version of the book was prompted by the emergence of qualitative research, and Open University courses were asking students, particularly in education, to carry out case study research, for example, in their own institution, which is what I did. And whereas students seem to be more confident with numerical data, they weren't as confident in knowing how to structure a research report which was qualitative in nature. Having said that, the book also contains sections on how to collect numerical data and how to analyze it. But it's an interesting question, because I guess at the time of the first copy of the book, which was in 1987, certainly people were less experienced in tackling qualitative research, and perhaps the research studies that were in evidence at the time tended to focus on numerical data, probably from a scientific model, whereas as you've heard today, we look at both qualitative and quantitative research, and we also, as Helen has pointed out, we also cover the perspective of the researcher, rather than assuming a researcher has a kind of an objective point of view. Their point of view can be influenced by their own beliefs about the world. And perhaps finally, maybe it's because students are questioning what the world is about, and that, that might be because of political events and their concerns about what society means. and that's a question for debate, isn't it? I mean, it would be good to hear from the students about why they've chosen qualitative research if they have done.
Yeah, we've got response from Gillian saying, "Thank you, Helen. I agree entirely. I'm a qualitative researcher. I have enjoyed the greater freedom of creative qualitative methods of late, which are much more acceptable these days."
It might be worth saying too that there is a less good reason why some students choose qualitative research as well, and this is particularly I see with psychology undergrads, which is that they think it's easier. They get a nasty shock when they realize it's not, and they hate statistics. So there's also that's worth mentioning. But yeah, they get a nasty shock generally when they do go for something that they think is easier, particularly when they very much have a logical positivist approach. They have very much taken that lay science approach and that mainstream science approach on board, and then they go into qualitative research and realize that they very often have to look at the world very, very differently. And so, this is where things like ontology and epistemology and positionality become really key. And as I say, I've really struggled to find accessible materials on those things for new researchers. Hopefully that's something we've addressed with the new edition of the book.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that some students select qualitative research because they think it's going to be easier, and in lots of ways it's harder than quantitative research. And in the book we kind of emphasize the fact that in order to produce a successful research project out of qualitative research, if anything, you've got to be more structured than when you're focusing only on quantitative data, or as structured. And we spend quite a lot of time talking about structuring the research and then getting feedback on that structure before setting off and gathering the data. Because as the book Metaphor of the Maze points out, you can be sent down dead ends and find yourself lost if you haven't got that structure from the get-go, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another comment from Gillian. "Thank you, Steve and Helen. I will look at the new material about researcher positionality. Always difficult to find less complex explanations, which I'm hoping this new book will provide." So that's great. Thank you, Gillian. I have a question of my own for Helen and Steve, if I might. And I think it's a question that might be in some people's heads at the moment on ethics and integrity. So this is an area that has come to the forefront as a result of the emergence of generative AI. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how can supervisors guide students to use generative AI responsibly, and what advice would you give to supervisors who are struggling with students who are delivering writing entirely generated by generative AI?
Well, that's a big question. I think when this version of the book was published, AI was just kind of hitting, ChatGPT was just hitting the internet. So we haven't covered it in detail, because I guess by the time the book is published, then whatever advice we had would be out of date. But I think one of the key pieces of advice is that if a student asks ChatGPT, for example, to write their research report, then they have to have a high level of knowledge of English in order to be able to adapt what they're offered to suit their purposes. So it's not the case that, for example, there's a fear that ChatGPT might allow students to just write a report with a number of questions put into the ChatGPT question box. But as an English teacher, for example, I can spot the difference between a report that's been written by ChatGPT and one that hasn't. But that requires quite a high level of knowledge of the structure of English as a language to do that. And you have to also have a lot of experience in reading a lot of students' English submissions, whether it be research or otherwise, to be able to do that. Now, most students, certainly undergrads, probably wouldn't have the level of English required to be able to adapt and modify it. And of course, if you submit a research report that isn't written by you, then you've broken an ethical code to begin with. So that might lead to issues with your research being accepted. So I think my advice would be, so let's think about the social media question again. So a student might put into ChatGPT, can you give me advice on qualitative research methods I could use in order to investigate this question? And they might get quite helpful advice. But as for writing the final report, I think ethically they should be writing that themselves, and they shouldn't be asking AI to do that. And
can I add? Sorry.
Yeah, certainly, Helen. Yeah, and just to say, this question is being debated, with students in high schools who are getting ChatGPT to write their homework, for example, and schools are wrestling with this right now. Sorry, Helen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think universities are yeah, I was going to say just catching up, they're not. But they're just starting to think about this, and I think there's a real proliferation of different approaches and responses. So and if you're working within a university, of course you need to follow that institution's guidance. I think it would be very, very difficult at the moment to write any kind of guide on it. For students, I think what I would say is I think that often the dissertation is the thing that the students, I'm thinking of undergrads here, but is the thing that students struggle most with. And the reason they struggle with it most, or some of the reasons, are because of that independence of study, because of doing something, like I said, coming up with ideas for something, coming up with research questions, the amount of autonomy that is involved in that. And if you are using something like ChatGPT up to the point, for your first and second years, that is going to be even more of a shock than it would have been otherwise, because you're going to find it even more difficult, because I just don't think that you can, at least as things currently stand, to say, ChatGPT, do my research. It's clearly, it's an area where you need to be able to come up with your ideas. You need to be creative, and you need to be responsive, and you need to apply things in very specific ways. It's not simply just like writing an essay, and the literature review is specifically tailored to the research question and so on. So I think it's much more difficult to use things like assistive AI in research and in research writing. But if you have been relying on it, this is where it's really going to show for you. So I think it's kind of a cautionary tale in that sense.
Yeah, thank you both. I think what you said about building that independent thinking into year 1, year 2 is really important, for sure, to be able to have that confidence when it comes to a research project. And we're now coming to the end of the session. So I would just like to say a big thank you to both Steve and Helen for their presentations and insights. It's been fabulous having you here. And if any of the attendees would like to receive a sample copy of the book to consider for the courses, please do get in touch with us. We'd be happy to provide those. And I hope you enjoyed the session. And good luck with those supervisions moving forward. Thank you.
Just to ask, Beatrice, just before we finish, are you going to send a copy of the slides to those who attended?
So everyone who has registered for the event will receive the presentation.
Great. Okay, so thank you for attending, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.